Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Waimea Valley's 2021 web series. The first in our web series today will be composting kitchen waste. And we're going to dedicate this one to my mom, Natalie Middleton, who taught me everything I know about composting. So as we get started here, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Hi'ipaka LLC, the not-for-profit that owns and operates Waimea Valley. Our mission here is to preserve and perpetuate the human, cultural, and environmental resources of Waimea Valley through education and stewardship for generations to come. And as part of that, we would like to malama our community, and that's part of the role of these web series is to present topics to our community here on Oahu's North Shore, as well as our community around the world. The part of that mission that we're addressing today is community education and hopefully stewardship of your lawn and garden. So one of the things composting can do is to reduce our waste. So when we ask the question, why do we compost? There's actually 3 reasons that we're going to focus on. In terms of our waste, this is the food waste from our kitchen. Primarily, we're going to be talking about composting organic waste. So this would be your fruit and vegetable scraps. We will touch briefly at the end of the presentation on composting of meat and dairy and cooked food, but typically that's another process. So in terms of reducing that waste, this is just a way of redirecting those kitchen scraps from your trash can into your compost bucket and recycling them in your garden. The second reason that we compost is to provide a resource for our garden. So as we're all growers here, we'd like to feed our plants, and composting, we're actually making plant food. So the way we like to think about that is the soil ecology, which is composed of the inorganic components, the silt, sand, and clay, but also the organic components, which would be our organic nutrients. Those are our primary plant nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. But there's also the carbon component of the soil that really is the basis for the food web of all the bacteria and microorganisms and fungus that is resident in our soil. And that soil ecology is very important for cycling of nutrients, but also connecting those nutrients to the plants through their roots and the symbiosis that those organisms have with the plants. So our soil health and our soil richness can be increased through composting methods. And then finally, we'd like to talk a little bit about connecting with our natural process overall. So one reason that you would take this extra time to compost and would be just like you're growing plants in your garden, this is another way to connect with a natural process. This is decomposition. And really, if you think about nature, where would we be without decomposition? We'd be neck deep in leaves and tree litter. It's got to go somewhere. So it's pretty amazing to see your compost pile form and then shrink and almost disappear. We'd like to say it's humus, not hummus. The humic layer in the soil is that layer that contains the organic matter. It's usually the first 2 to 6 inches in the soil, and being connected to that part of our ecosystem is really wonderful. Today we'll be talking about our materials and methods for composting our kitchen waste. So this is the organic matter that we're generating in the kitchen every day. We'll do a little bit of a process overview, talking about decomposition in the compost, and then some troubleshooting at the end. And one of the reasons this is a webinar is because we hope there is some audience participation. So if you folks have questions, please let our moderator know, either by texting or doing the hand raise, and we'll get you into the live stream with some questions and answers. All right, and let's kick it right off with getting into our materials and methods. So the first thing that I found is really helpful is to have a bucket and a good lid to collect your kitchen waste. Mostly what we'll be talking about today is composting fruit and vegetable scraps from your kitchen. And a key ingredient we'll be talking about is grass clippings from your yard. So we'll get into that more. All right. So one of the things that can be a little intimidating starting your kitchen composting is collecting all of those scraps. So what I have here is a picture of my compost bucket. And this is a threaded lid that you can get at most hardware stores that attaches to a regular 5-gallon bucket. Now, the first bullet point I have here is called the Shuttle. A lot of people do have another container right on their kitchen counter. I also recommend something with a sealable lid. This could be a Tupperware, could be a glass jar or mason jar that seals, or even something that from the grocery store that you're reusing. So the key here is that it's something that you can have on the counter with you as you prepare your meals, and it just collects the kitchen waste as you generate it. So I call this the Shuttle because it's something you would be emptying after almost every meal prep or at the end of each day. So it's not something where you're going to be storing your kitchen scraps for long term. Although you may find that it's just convenient for you to have that bucket right in your kitchen. Maybe it's under the sink or to the side of your trash can. But again, the key thing here is to have a nice seal on this initial collection. Some people do want to have a larger collection, and I have seen people using larger trash cans to collect their kitchen scraps. Now, that would take us to the third point here, which is the sweat. So the longer you keep these scraps in the collection bucket, so this would be your sealed trash can or 5-gallon bucket, this would be in between periods of composting, those materials are going to start to undergo anaerobic decomposition. So they're going to start sweating, putting out moisture into that container, and it can get a little funky. I'm not going to lie here. This is something that, again, as we kind of talk about what some of the challenges are to composting your kitchen scraps, the bigger the bucket, the longer you keep those materials before composting them, the more this anaerobic process, the sweat's going to happen, and you're going to get things that'll start to be a little bit funky in that bucket. So all the more reason to have a good seal on it. And what are we going to compost? Well, today we're going to talk about mostly a compost strategy that works for organic matter. So your vegetable scraps, your fruit scraps, and things that some people have questions about, eggshells, coffee grounds, those are okay. So pretty much everything except our next slide here, where you don't want to be composting, and that's going to be your meat, your dairy items, and cooked food. And a lot of people are wondering, well, why can't I just throw everything in the compost? It's all organic, right? And the reason is vermin. So once you get into the compost in your yard, those meat scraps and dairy scraps are going to be attracting individuals we don't want as part of our composting process, such as rats. So now we're on to our next important ingredient. And this is now you've got your bucket full of kitchen scraps. It's all of your good fruit and vegetables. And now you're moving into the garden. And one of the key things here is going to be what I like to use are grass clippings. Now, this isn't the only source of carbon you can mix with your kitchen scraps. But for me, it's worked the best over time. If you do have a lawn and you're mowing your lawn, this is an available resource. And it's actually another waste product that maybe you can divert away from trash cans or trash pickup into this kitchen compost. And it's kind of like two great wastes that go great together. So the nice thing about your grass clippings is that they're really fine. There's not a lot of woody material. And so they compost quickly with your kitchen scraps. And they also tend to suppress odors very well, almost like a blanket. So can really suppress flies, odor, and kind of keep your compost orderly in the garden. So just to talk a little bit about this ratio. So just like cooking in the kitchen, when you're composting, the ratios are important. So when we get into troubleshooting, we'll talk a little bit more about this. The scientific ratio that doesn't really help too much is 30-1. So 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. The thing about it is everything's got a little carbon, a little nitrogen. So if you think about your kitchen scraps, they're going to be higher in nitrogen, have a little bit more water, whereas your grass clippings are going to be higher in carbon and be a little bit drier. So as we start to mix our pile, these are some of the variables that we'll be talking about. So making the pile. So now we've got our bucket and our grass clippings and we're ready to start cooking up our compost. So finding a good location for this pile is part of the joy of composting in your yard. You can find those little used corners kind of off to the side that maybe have been neglected or there's nothing really happening there. Thinking ahead about this, at the end of your composting time, maybe you use this site for a month or 6 months, that area will become very fertile where this compost has been placed. So if it's an area maybe that haven't had success growing things in the past, maybe it's a little too shady or the soil there just doesn't have a lot of nutrients. Maybe it's too much clay or too much sand. That might be a good place to place your compost pile because after this period of composting, the soil will gain in organic matter and become much more rich in that location. Another real secret as you start to mix in your grass clippings and your compost bucket is you're going to want to bring forward 20% of that old compost. So initially you won't have this 20%. So that first compost is going to take a little bit longer to build up this community of bacteria that really do the work of composting. But in your future compost piles, you should always reserve 20% of that finished compost material to start your new compost pile. And that's going to just greatly accelerate the composting time. One of the great things about doing this pile method is that the composting can happen very quickly. So instead of 4 weeks or even months where your compost is just sitting there, you'll find that this is a hot, fast compost pile that most of the material that you put in there is going to be gone within a matter of weeks. So usually about 2 weeks to a full decomposition of this organic matter. And that's kind of nice because you don't want this stuff sitting around in your yard. You want to keep this process moving and get that finished compost that you can then spread around to your plants, your garden, your house plants, your fruit trees, wherever you want plants to grow. And then last thing is when you are mixing in this grass, one of the key things with the ratio is you want to have a nice mix so that the pile is not too wet. So if you feel like you kind of mix in your grass and your compost scraps, but now you have kind of just a wet mess, probably not enough grass. And it's good to keep a little bit of grass on reserve so that you can add those clippings to the top, almost like a cover. So you may find that one bag of grass to one bucket isn't enough for you. Maybe 2 bags of grass. Now, on the flip side, we'll get into this in troubleshooting, but if your compost pile is just sitting there and not composting, you may actually have too much grass. So one of the alternatives, if you don't have a lawn, is you can collect mulch material. On Oahu, we get that free from the Menehune Magic folks. You just got to go pick it up. But that stuff tends to be a little bit more woody. And so you might find that it takes a little longer. You might need a little bit less initially to make that pile. And that's where we get into the ratio of this mix. So again, grass clippings work really well. If you don't have a lawn, I have in the past raked up some grass clippings from the park. They tend not to collect those grass clippings when the mower comes through. So your neighborhood park might be a resource, or one of your neighbors. You might notice they have a big lawn and they're dumping all of that stuff into their trash can, or they have a pile behind their house. Um, so making that pile, you got to have the materials that you need, and hopefully you get the right mix. A lot of this is kind of trial and error and making sure that it works well for you. I like to do a nice mix with a fork or a shovel and stir those ingredients together, and then put that nice blanket of grass on top to kind of seal that off while the composting gets to work and all those organisms get to work eating your kitchen waste. Now, the process of decomposition. We talked a little bit about anaerobic bacteria. So that's that process of sweat in the beginning in the bucket. Another really important part of this is going to be our detritivores. These are the organisms, insects, worms, grubs that you might be seeing in your compost. What their job is to break all of that organic matter down into smaller pieces. So again, with our grass clippings, those are kind of already chopped up into pretty small pieces. But the food waste that you put in there might be kind of bigger chunks. So if you have some big pieces, maybe there's even whole vegetables that you didn't quite get to cooking and you're just throwing them out. You can throw them in your compost, but that's when you kind of need these detritivores to break those up into smaller pieces. So another thing that can kind of turn people off from compost is, oh, they lifted up their compost and they found little cockroaches and beetles and worms and grubs, and it was all just a bit much. But those organisms do have a role in this process. They tend to kind of stay in the compost and not branch out too far. But we will get into a discussion in our troubleshooting section of these vermin are becoming pests, and that's not something we want to have with our compost pile. So in the best case scenario, your compost is not too wet and it's not too full of bugs, so just the right amount. And then the last one we'll talk about in this process is our aerobic bacteria. Now, aerobic bacteria are doing the most work in our compost. They're really the ones that are cycling these nutrients from the finished form of the vegetable and the fruit and back into soil nutrients. We can't see these bacteria, but we know that they're there, and they're everywhere. If you build it, they will come. So getting the right mix, you're going to see those aerobic bacteria start to go to work. The main way you'll see it is just by the volume of your compost pile decreasing. So as that pile gets digested, you're just going to see it go from a big pile down to almost nothing. And what you can do to help these aerobic bacteria is, if you feel like you want to accelerate the process, you can give your pile a turn. Sometimes it's helpful, if you don't have a lot of extra grass clippings, to just pull that top layer off to the side, give the pile kind of a vigorous turn with your shovel or fork, and then put that grass clippings back on top. If the pile's a bit wet as you turn it, you may not have quite enough oxygen, and these aerobic bacteria need oxygen to process it. So if your compost pile isn't decomposing fast enough, that may be an issue. You might need to add some of that grass that you have left over to kind of accelerate it. On the flip side, if your pile is real dry and you just kind of see all the dried out fruit and vegetable scraps mixed in with your grass, you may actually need to use a little bit less grass in the next making. And you can also try watering your pile a little bit to just increase the moisture, because the aerobic bacteria, very much like us, they need some water and they need oxygen to do their work. So that's the process. One more thing we do, if you're building your compost pile here in Hawaii, we do have an invasive pest that we're very concerned about, called the coconut rhinoceros beetle. And part of the life cycle of that pest is it will be a grub in your garden. So the issue with this is that in Hawaii, we do have a rose beetle that has a very similar looking grub. But if you find these larvae in your compost pile, it's worth doing a little online research to help ID them out a little bit farther to make sure you're not hosting this invasive pest in your compost pile. Um, so nothing to scare you away, but just something to be aware of, and you might need to do a little bit more research. I also did include um, a phone number there where you can link to someone who can help you ID those grubs a little further. They look very similar to the rose beetle, so those may be there. All right, we're on to our troubleshooting section. So for those of you who are new to composting, it's very common to have some challenges getting into this. And again, the reason we're doing these webinars is because maybe we can provide some of our expertise, but also some of the lessons learned from all our past failures to you folks as you get into your composting journey. Right off the bat, the biggest one that people are concerned about and often do have an issue with is odor. So starting off with the sweat, which is that initial collection of your food waste. If you notice that container is getting quite a bit of an odor, particularly between compostings, one thing you can do is use baking soda rinse on your bucket, and that'll help to kind of reduce the odor in the bucket. The other thing is maybe you're just waiting a little bit too long, whether it's from your shuttle to your bucket or from your bucket to your compost pile. If those materials are becoming really anaerobic, they're going to start producing quite a bit of odors. Similarly, in your compost pile, if you feel like you're getting a lot of odor coming off the compost pile, my guess is you're probably have too much of an anaerobic process. The pile is probably pretty wet and doesn't have enough carbon. So looking at bringing in maybe a mulch material or more grass clippings to kind of help dry out that pile, add more carbon to it, and that helps also to add oxygen to your pile. So if you do use a coarser carbon like a mulch or a wood chip or even sawdust in some cases can be helpful. That can add a little bit more of a structure to your pile and allow more air, which will reduce that anaerobic process and should reduce any odors. And finally, the idea of kind of capping your pile with just a pure carbon source, like almost like a little lid, can really help to reduce odors. Just anything kind of, particularly as you first make your pile, the first mix, as you're bringing all that stuff out of your bucket that has been sweating, it has been going anaerobic. You can kind of have some odors with that initial mix, and just by putting that grass cap on top, can keep that smell from wafting over through the neighborhood on the trade wind breeze. So those are a couple ideas for odor. Timing, I have a little calendar here that shows our webinar, and then you started collecting your kitchen waste and your bucket was full, but you had already cut your lawn. So a couple of ideas here for timing. One is if you cut your grass clippings, you can store those. You don't have to use them right away. You can throw those in a trash bag. I like to keep the bag open so the bag and the clippings don't start to go anaerobic, but it's good to keep them out of the rain. So if you have an area where you can just make that pile that's a little bit sheltered, or leave that trash bag open but under an eave, so that those grass clippings don't get real wet, then you can store those for up to a week or two until you're ready to make your compost mix. Now, it would be great if you, and sometimes it's even helpful to help you, encourage you to trim your yard. Hey, that bucket's full and time to cut the grass so we can have some clippings to mix in with our compost. So timing is really helpful in setting that up. Now, if you do end up going to collect some carbon material from other locations, having that on hand so that it's ready when your bucket's full is really helpful. You don't want to leave that bucket full of kitchen scraps too long. That anaerobic process starts happening and it can get pretty gross. So other things that can happen as we move into vermin. So we already talked a little bit about rats, but with that bucket, with that anaerobic process and having, even with the seal on it, you may get some flies leaving eggs, maybe house flies where you'd recognize those maggots, might be like fruit flies trying to get into your bucket and lay some eggs. So again, the timing, if you see any kind of vermin starting up, it's probably past time for you to empty that bucket. If you do have that process and you do see like egg laying on your kitchen collection, you're just going to want to make sure that you're cleaning off all of those eggs before you restart collecting in that container. So once you make your mix, if you stuck to our plan and you're only using vegetable scraps and fruit scraps, you shouldn't have issues in your garden compost with rats, but you may have cockroaches. Now, in Hawaii, we have a kind of a yard roach that's kind of light brown and smaller. It's not the same B-52 bomber that you see in the house. So that should be fine in your compost. But if you do see the other cockroach that can be a pest in the home as well, that can be a problem. So a couple ideas. One is to just stop composting for a second. I know it's going to be hard to going back to throwing all your kitchen scraps in the trash. What a waste. But that can be a way to eliminate that pest, and you just kind of stop composting. You may need to take away your pile, spread out that organic material into your garden, and just wait for those organisms to kind of leave the area. Another option is to use insecticide to kind of kill a population, but you can never kill them all. So it's important to kind of stop that process. And then another technique you might try and use is to just move the compost to a new location. So maybe abandon that site in your yard, move to another area, and hopefully those vermin don't follow you over there. Finally, if you do have rats, that's a really bad one. Similar solution, kind of stop for a second, assess the population, see where they're coming from. You certainly don't want to be encouraging vermin in your neighborhood. So be aware of that, be watchful. Most of the things attracted to this compost are going to be not household pests and shouldn't kind of move farther than the compost. But those are some of the issues that you might have starting your composting journey. And quickly, alternatives. So for folks who are living in apartments, who don't have a yard, don't have grass clippings, don't have a place to make this compost pile, we want you to compost too. One alternative is a worm bin. Now, worms are one of our important detritivores, that they're also going to be kind of a specialized composting. This webinar didn't really cover worm bin composting, but there are some other resources online, and potentially we could do a webinar on that if there's a lot of interest. You know, fortunately here in Hawaii, we have such great weather year round. The garden compost is super easy, and we have the weather for it. So that's nice. But hey, we do have a lot of apartment dwellers here in Hawaii, and composting is possible for you as well. Typically in an apartment, you're generating a little bit less kitchen waste, which is helpful for the worm bin process, which is a little bit slower than you have some other issues in terms of quantity of compost that aren't as much of a factor when you're doing a yard compost. But the worm bins I've witnessed being highly effective, odor-free, and just a really neat part of your apartment environment. And you can use those worm castings to great effect on houseplants. So if you are in that situation, don't give up yet. There's an option for you. The second alternative here is soldier fly larvae. These are another important detritivore that you'll find in your compost, but people do have specialized soldier fly composting This is something that works really well if you want to compost meat and dairy and cooked food. So for the restaurant industry, for people who just have that as a large part of their diet and want to engage in that, it's a little bit different. And again, I would encourage you to find additional resources about the soldier fly larva composting. But as with the worm bins, I've seen it used very successfully to great effect. Hasn't been a problem with other vermin, and the soldier fly larvae do a really good job with that type of composting. A little bit more maintenance, you need a little bit more structure for the larva, but there are alternatives out there. And finally, for those of you who just don't really feel like a pile could do it, there are some other aftermarket products you can get for your garden that they can be helpful for starting up composting. A lot of these are like drum-based products where you have a little bit more of a defined compost. This can also be helpful if you don't really have a good place in your yard for a kitchen pile, or you would just like to have something that's maybe a little bit more contained. These products, again, can be useful. They're out there. Just in my experience, the pile has always been the easiest. It doesn't require pallets or fencing or any additional costs. All you really need is, that carbon source and your kitchen waste, and you can just really go to town. So that's why I chose to present that in this webinar. But if you folks have other ideas, other questions, certainly there are some alternatives out there. All right, finally, thanks so much for tuning in to our webinar. Are there any questions out there?
How many worms do you need?
Well, in the kitchen garden compost, it's similar to the bacteria. If you build it, they will come, and there's going to be a lot of worms crawling around in there. For the worm bins, they actually have specific species of worm that they recommend, and there's a good amount of worms in there.
Hi, Daddy. Okay, thank you.
Hi, Isabella. It's so nice to see you at the webinar. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning into this first webinar in our series. Hi, Sandy. And just wanted to acknowledge the Institute of Museum and Library Services. They made a very generous grant to Hi'ipaka LLC, the company here at Waimea Valley. And it supports our outreach to our audience as we've been separated by this pandemic. And we hope to, in the future webinars in this series, bring you folks closer to Waimea Valley, give you contact with some of our other great staff members, and all of the great knowledge and information they can provide. And we really appreciate the support through the CARES Act for this program here at Waimea.
God put Jason, Dad.
All right, ahui ho. See you next time. Aloha.